If one day you find that the only sound in your house is the ticking of a clock, you'll begin to understand what silence really means. It had been 3 months since Franklin's wife passed. Every morning he sat on the same side of the old couch, the one with a cushion that sagged just enough to remember her. In his hand, a cup of tea he never drank. In his lap, the TV remote he never used. He didn't want to watch anything. He just wanted the silence to end. This house wasn't always like this. It used to hum with life. The smell of bacon and burnt toast, the laughter of children arguing over cereal boxes, the clink of his wife's wedding ring against the sink as she did dishes. Now everything was still. Loneliness, he realized, doesn't come crashing in like a storm. It seeps in slowly, the way fog rolls over the lake in early spring, soft, quiet, and everywhere. Then one evening just after dinner, a thought crept in. Not loud, not dramatic, just a question, simple and cold. If I fall tomorrow and no one's here, how long before someone notices? Franklin was 63. He had worked maintenance for the county school district for over 30 years. A steady job, a modest life. 2 kids, now grown, living their own lives in other cities. They called, of course, birthdays, holidays. But he had learned not to expect more. They loved him, but their lives were busy. And his was quiet, too quiet. Here's the truth no one likes to say out loud. Growing old doesn't just mean your back aches and your memory slips. It means people stop needing you. Your phone rings less. And somewhere along the way, you become the background to everyone else's story. Some people in their 70s wake up early, go for walks, join book clubs, plan cruises. Others, like Franklin, sit quietly in a chair they didn't choose to be alone in, wondering when their name stopped mattering. Most don't complain. They just say, "I'm fine." But that's the lie they tell to make it easier for everyone else to walk away. What happens when the family you built now has a life too full to include you? What do you do when you don't want to be a burden, but you also don't want to disappear? Today, I want to tell you Franklin's story, not because it's unique, but because it's not. Because somewhere in this story, you might see your father, or your neighbor, or maybe, in a few years, even yourself. He lost the woman he loved. He lost the noise, the mess, the reason to cook a full meal. But what he found afterward surprised even him. So before you scroll past, give me a few minutes. Because this isn't just a story about grief. It's a story about waking up to the truth that life isn't over, even when it feels like it is. The quiet collapse. Franklin didn't notice the change at first. It didn't come with tears or breakdowns. It crept in quietly, like dust gathering on a bookshelf no one touches anymore. He stopped shaving every morning. At first, it was because there wasn't anyone around to notice. But a few days turned into weeks, then months. He told himself it didn't matter. The truth was, he didn't feel like he belonged in mirrors anymore. Meals became simpler, sometimes just toast. Other times, he'd skip dinner altogether. Cooking for one felt like a reminder, not of what he had, but of what was missing. He left the second plate in the cupboard, untouched, like some kind of silent memorial. He still answered the phone when his daughter called. Still said, "I'm fine, sweetie." But in between those calls were days where the only voice he heard was his own, asking the dog if she needed to go out. And here's the strange thing. He wasn't even sure what was happening to him. He wasn't in pain. He wasn't crying. But something inside him was slowly going dim. Until one Tuesday afternoon, something finally snapped. He walked into the kitchen and stood there, staring at the kettle on the stove. For 5 whole minutes, he couldn't remember why he was there. He wasn't sick. His memory wasn't failing. He just forgot what it felt like to have a reason. That night, he couldn't sleep. The quiet was louder than ever. So he opened a drawer and pulled out an old envelope, the one with the family photo they'd taken on their last vacation before Susan got sick. Lake Michigan, 2012. He looked at her smile, the way she always tilted her head in photos. She was gone now, and he was still here. But for what? That's when he remembered something Susan once said. They were walking home from a friend's funeral, both of them quiet, and she turned to him and said, "You know what's worse than dying, Frank? It's slowly disappearing while you're still alive. It was a throwaway line. He laughed when she said it, but now, more than a decade later, it landed like a punch to the chest. That night, as the wind rustled through the trees outside, Franklin sat in the dark and finally asked himself the question he'd been avoiding for months. What if this is it? What if nothing ever changes? Here's the truth. Aging doesn't just test your body. It tests your will to keep showing up. When no one's clapping, no one's calling, and no one seems to need you anymore. But the deeper question is this: do you still need yourself? Do you still believe you're worth the effort, even when no one's watching? The next morning, something shifted. Not big, not dramatic, but real. Franklin put on a clean shirt, the kind with buttons. He brushed his teeth, combed his hair, and walked 2 blocks to the park near his house. He didn't talk to anyone, just sat on a bench and watched the world go by. It wasn't healing, it wasn't a solution, but it was a start. Because sometimes climbing out of the dark begins with something as small as being seen by the sun. Rebuilding from the outside. In the bench at the park didn't look like much, but to Franklin it was a small island in a sea of sameness. He came back the next day, and the next. At first just to sit, then to stretch his legs. By the end of the week, he found himself nodding hello to a woman walking a golden retriever. She smiled. He smiled back. It felt strange, like his face had forgotten how to do that. That weekend, he ran into Mr. Dalton, his neighbor from 2 doors down, retired firefighter, widower too. They hadn't talked in months. Dalton squinted at him. "Franklin, you all right?" Franklin hesitated. For the first time, he didn't say, "I'm fine." He paused, then simply said, "I don't know." Dalton nodded, not surprised, not sorry, just understanding. "You want to come by for coffee later? My grandson's teaching me how to play chess. I'm terrible at it, but it keeps the brain busy." And that's how it began. Not with a grand gesture, not with therapy or big speeches. Just 2 men sitting at a wobbly table, pretending to care about pawn strategy, while quietly rebuilding something much more important: connection. From there, things began to unfold. Franklin started going to the local senior center. Not every day, not even most days. But sometimes. The room was noisy. Some people were louder than he liked. But there was coffee, there were board games, and, more importantly, there were people who remembered his name. He began cooking again. Not because anyone expected him to, but because he finally felt like eating with real silverware. He even bought groceries he hadn't touched in months. Parsley, garlic, fresh tomatoes. Ingredients that meant care. It wasn't a miracle. There were still nights when the house felt too quiet, when he'd hear a creak and instinctively turn, hoping to see his wife reading in the corner. But those moments hurt a little less now, because he had something to look forward to. Even if it was just a chess match he knew he'd lose. There's a secret about loneliness no one tells you. It doesn't vanish all at once. It fades in pieces, replaced slowly by presence, by the hand that passes you a cup of coffee, by the smile that says, "I'm glad you're here," by the sound of your name said out loud by someone who means it. Franklin had spent months thinking what he needed was time to heal. But what he really needed was people to heal with. In a world that tells older adults to stay strong and not be a burden, maybe the bravest thing Franklin ever did was to say yes. Yes to a neighbor. Yes to a walk. Yes to sitting at a table and letting someone care that he showed up. It wasn't about filling the silence. It was about sharing it. And for the first time in a long time, Franklin wasn't just passing time. He was living again. A companion, not a replacement. Her name was Elise. They met on a Thursday evening at the community center during a card game Franklin didn't even want to join. She laughed too loud, wore too much perfume, and had a way of pointing out when people bent the rules just enough to keep things interesting. She reminded him of no one, and that's exactly why he noticed her. At first it was nothing. A casual wave when they passed each other near the coffee pot. A short joke about how no one ever cleaned the checkers board properly. But over time, their greetings became conversations, and conversations became habits. One afternoon, Elise brought in homemade muffins. "These are too good to eat alone. she said, placing a small paper bag beside Franklin's seat. "I figured you'd understand." He smiled, but part of him tensed, because even as warmth filled the air, guilt crept in through the back door. Was he ready for this? What would Susan think if she could see him now? Laughing again, accepting muffins from someone who wasn't her. He went home that evening torn in two. He sat at the edge of his bed, holding the edge of his sleeve, thinking about the way Elise said his name. So light, so ordinary, like it belonged to the present, not the past. And that somehow felt like betrayal. But the truth is, Franklin hadn't stopped loving Susan. He never would. What changed wasn't the love, but the space it lived in. It had become quieter, less painful, less like a wound, and more like a photograph you carry in your wallet, creased, faded, but never forgotten. He remembered something Mr. Dalton had said one morning during their walk. Losing someone doesn't mean the world owes you silence forever. It just means you've learned the cost of love. Doesn't mean you stop spending. That line stuck with him, not because it was profound, but because it gave permission. Permission to feel again, to laugh without apology, to miss Susan and still hold someone else's hand. So he took a risk. He asked Elise if she'd like to walk with him in the park. She said yes without hesitation. They didn't talk about deep things. Not at first. Just weather, the dog that barked too much on 4th Street, and which diner had the best meatloaf. But the silence between them felt safe, familiar even. Weeks turned into months. They started grocery shopping together, swapping old recipes, watching reruns of shows neither of them liked, just to have something on in the background. They never called it love, but it was something steady, something real. And when Franklin came down with a bad cough one rainy evening, it was Elise who knocked on his door with soup, cough drops, and the kind of concern that wrapped itself around you like a blanket you didn't know you needed. He looked at her then, standing in his hallway in her old blue coat and mismatched socks, and he knew. This wasn't about forgetting Susan. It was about letting life continue, about sharing a little more time with someone who understood what silence meant and didn't try to fix it, just stayed through it. Love in old age isn't fireworks or poetry. It's warm meals, quiet company, and someone who knows which side of the bed you prefer without asking. Franklin hadn't planned for any of this. He thought his story had already been written. But life, it turns out, is full of margins waiting to be filled. And sometimes the most beautiful chapters come long after you thought the book was over. When plans shift. It was a Sunday morning when everything changed. Franklin had just finished folding the laundry, something Elise usually helped with, even though she always claimed he was better at it. He chuckled to himself, holding up one of her scarves that still smelled faintly of lavender. Then the phone rang. Adam, his son. Urgent, shaky voice. "Dad, it's Elise. There was an accident. She's in the hospital." Franklin didn't ask questions. He didn't cry. He just grabbed his coat and keys and was out the door in under 5 minutes. The drive to the hospital felt both too fast and too slow. Time distorted, warped by the gravity of not knowing. He found her in the ICU, pale and still. Tubes, monitors, a nurse adjusting something beside her bed. The doctor was kind, but his words were unkind in their precision. "She has internal bleeding, severe trauma. At her age, the odds are not good." Franklin nodded. He heard the words, but they didn't land. Not yet. He sat by her side, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest. "You didn't have to come this far, Elise," he whispered. "You were just supposed to stay for the easy parts." And then her eyes fluttered open. Barely. Her hand twitched and he took it. Cold. Fragile. But hers. She didn't say much. She didn't have to. 3 words, that was all. "Franklin, live well." And then she was gone. No drama, no warning, just silence. Again. For the second time in his life, Franklin felt the earth shift beneath him, not with noise, but with absence. He didn't scream, didn't cry in front of anyone. He simply sat there holding her hand long after it had gone still. Later that night, back home, the house felt smaller than ever. Not because Elise had taken up space, but because her presence had filled the gaps. The teacup she liked, the book she left unfinished, The way she always adjusted the thermostat by exactly 2 degrees. Gone. People said kind things. His kids called more often. Mr. Dalton dropped by with pie, but the ache was his alone. For weeks, Franklin drifted. He showed up at the center less, stopped shaving again. Meals got simpler. But then, one morning something happened. He saw a new resident at the senior center, an older man, quiet, uncertain, looking lost in a sea of unfamiliar faces. The man stood by the wall during bingo. No card in hand, no expression, just waiting for it to be over. Franklin walked over. "First week?" he asked. The man nodded. "It gets better," Franklin said. "Come sit with us. The coffee's terrible, but the company's all right." That was it. Not a grand act, not a speech, just a moment of passing the torch, offering what had once been offered to him. Because grief doesn't vanish, it becomes part of your architecture. You learn to live with the extra room it builds inside you, and sometimes that room becomes a place where someone else can heal too. Franklin still misses Elise and Susan, and every version of himself that existed before loss taught him how to love more gently. But he has come to understand something most people never say out loud. Love is not a chapter, it's the whole book, and some of the pages are written in sorrow, but all of them matter. The new beginning, finding purpose through presence. Spring arrived quietly, no grand announcement, just a few more birds outside the window, a little more light in the morning. Franklin noticed it while pouring coffee one day, the kind of noticing that comes when the noise inside you has finally settled enough to hear the world again. He had returned to his routine, not because he had to, but because he chose to. Mornings in the park, afternoons at the center, evenings on the porch with a blanket and a small radio playing old jazz. Grief, he had learned, doesn't go away. It just learns how to walk beside you without stepping on your heels. And in that quiet companionship, he found something unexpected, a different kind of peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of remembering without falling apart. Franklin no longer tried to fill the house with sound. He let it be quiet. But now it was a chosen silence, not a punishment. He volunteered once a week at the local library, shelving books and sometimes reading aloud to second graders on field trips. They laughed at his voice when he did the dragon impressions. He didn't mind. He wasn't trying to be young again. He was simply trying to stay present. At the senior center, he took notice of small things. Who looked down today? Who hadn't been showing up lately? He knew what silence could mean, and he refused to let someone else sit in it alone. One evening, a new resident, a widow in her late 60s, asked him why he still came to all these events. Franklin took a moment, then said, "Because I remember what it felt like when I stopped showing up, and how long it took me to start again." She nodded quietly, as if she understood more than she let on. That night, Franklin sat on his porch and stared at the sky, where the stars were just beginning to appear. He didn't talk to Susan, he didn't talk to Elise, but he thought of them, and he smiled, because the love they gave him, it didn't leave when they did. It stayed in how he moved through the world, in the way he listened, in the gentleness he extended to strangers. The truth is, some people think the final chapter of life is where the story ends. But Franklin had come to believe something else. The final chapter isn't the ending. It's the beginning of how you'll be remembered, how your presence, even after you're gone, lingers in the warmth you left behind. And that presence, quiet, consistent, kind, might just be the greatest legacy of all. If you followed Franklin's story this far, maybe you saw something familiar. Maybe you've lost someone. Maybe you've stopped showing up. Maybe you're wondering if it's too late to start again. It isn't. You don't have to fill the world with noise to matter. Sometimes all it takes is showing up with your whole self, even if that self is healing, fragile, or still learning how to smile again. So wherever you are, however old you feel, just know this: you are not done. There is still light, still laughter, still company waiting on a park bench or around a card table. All you have to do is say yes. Maybe you're watching this late at night. Maybe the house is quiet. Maybe, like Franklin once did, you've been telling the world, "I'm fine." If that's true, I want you to know something. You don't have to stay silent forever. You don't have to shrink into the background of your own life. Grief is real. Loneliness is real. But so is the possibility of new beginnings, even if they come quietly. Even if they look nothing like what came before. Maybe you won't find a new partner. Maybe your kids won't call as often as you wish. But there is always someone out there who needs what only you can offer. Your story, your presence, your kindness earned through everything you've endured. Franklin didn't rebuild his life all at once. He said yes to one thing, then another, then another. And eventually those yeses turned into a life worth waking up to again. So today, if you find yourself wondering whether there's still more ahead for you, I'll say it plainly. There is. Your value doesn't disappear with age. Your story is still being written, and someone, somewhere is waiting for the light you still carry. Live well, love again if you can, but most of all, don't stop showing up, because the most ordinary moments, shared over coffee, laughter, or even silence, are often the ones that matter most in the end. Thank you for being here. Take care of your heart. And maybe before you go, call someone you love. They just might be waiting to hear your voice. If this story touched something in you, if it made you remember someone or see yourself a little more clearly, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who might need it. A parent, a neighbor, a friend who's been too quiet lately. And if you'd like to hear more stories like Franklin's, real stories about real people facing life with courage, tenderness, and grace, consider subscribing to this channel. It's free, but it means the world to us. It helps this community grow. And most importantly, it helps more people realize they're not alone. So hit the like button if this story meant something to you. Subscribe if you believe in stories that heal. And turn on notifications if you want to be here for the next one. Until then, take care of your heart and don't forget, your presence still matters.